The forecast said 4 to 6 inches. That's what everybody heard on Wednesday night. 4 to 6 inches of snow starting Thursday morning, tapering off by evening. Schools might close. Roads might get slick. Nothing Central Illinois hadn't handled 1,000 times. Earl Braddock checked the forecast at 9 p.m. on January 17th, 2024, set his alarm for 4:30, and went to bed. By the time he woke up, the world had changed. The storm that hit Ford County on January 18th wasn't 4 to 6 inches. It was 23 inches in 14 hours, with sustained winds of 45 miles per hour and gusts hitting 60. The National Weather Service upgraded the warning 3 times between midnight and 6 a.m. But by then the power was out across the county, and nobody was getting alerts on phones that couldn't charge. The wind chill hit minus 32. Visibility dropped to 0. Not reduced visibility, 0. You could not see your hand in front of your face. Earl stood at the kitchen window at 5:15 a.m. and couldn't see the machine shed. The machine shed was 80 feet from the house. Ruth came up behind him with a cup of coffee and said, "Earl, you can't go out in this." He took the coffee and didn't answer because he was already counting. Not inches of snow, not degrees of wind chill, head of cattle. Earl ran a row crop operation, corn and beans, but he kept 40 head of beef cattle on the south pasture, a small herd, mostly because his father Walter had always kept cattle and Earl couldn't bring himself to sell them off. Those 40 head were in a 3-sided loafing shed with a round bale feeder and a stock tank with a heater. In normal winter weather, they were fine. In this, Earl didn't know. The stock tank heater ran on electricity. The electricity was out. If that tank froze, 40 head of cattle had no water. If the snow drifted against the open side of the loafing shed, they had no shelter. And if Earl couldn't get feed to them by midday, he had a problem that would compound by the hour. But Earl's 40 head weren't what kept him at that window. It was the 12 cattle operations south of Gibson City, along the timber, the guys running real herds. 100 head, 200 head. Harold Menke had 180 Angus on 640 acres down on the south end, and Harold was 74 years old, lived alone, and Earl knew for a fact that his truck hadn't started right since November. Earl picked up the landline. The landline still worked, one of the last copper lines in the county. He called Harold, no answer, called again, no answer, called Virgil Kemp. Virgil picked up on the second ring, which meant he was already in his shop, which meant he'd already been thinking the same thing Earl was thinking. "How many you figure are stuck?" Earl asked. "All of them," Virgil said. "Every cattleman south of town. Roads are gone. The plows haven't moved. County's got 3 trucks, and 2 of them were parked at the maintenance barn when the power went out. The electric doors won't open." Earl almost laughed at that. Almost. The county had 3 snow plows, and 2 of them were trapped behind electric garage doors that didn't work because the power was out. You couldn't write it any better if you tried. "I'm taking the 4440, Earl said. There was a pause on the line. Virgil knew what that meant. The 4440 was Walter Braddock's tractor, 1978. Earl had restored it with Virgil's help after bringing it back from Kansas. It was the tractor Earl kept in the shed and didn't let anyone else drive. It was not a snow tractor. It didn't have a cab heater that worked right. The windshield seal leaked. The hydraulics were 46 years old. But it had one thing that mattered on January 18th, 2024. It started. Every time. In any weather. Because Virgil Kemp had rebuilt that engine with his own hands. And when Virgil rebuilt an engine, it started. "I'll meet you at the road," Virgil said, and hung up. Nathan came downstairs at 5:30 and found Earl in the mudroom pulling on insulated coveralls over his Carhartt. "Where are you going?" Earl told him. Nathan said he was coming. Earl said no. Nathan said it again. And the way he said it, not angry, not arguing, just flat and certain, sounded so much like Walter that Earl stopped lacing his boots for a second and looked at his son and saw his father's jaw and his father's eyes and nodded once. Ruth didn't say, "Don't go." She'd been married to Earl Braddock for 34 years. She knew what that look meant. She packed a cooler with thermoses of coffee and hot water, sandwiches, hand warmers, and a first aid kit. She kissed Earl at the door and said, "You bring that tractor back." She didn't say, "Bring yourself back." She didn't need to. It was the same sentence. The 4440 started on the second crank. Earl could hear his father in that engine, in the way the diesel caught and settled into its idle, heavy and even, like a heartbeat that never rushed. Nathan climbed up on the left fender. There was no buddy seat. There was barely a cab. Earl dropped the 444, into second gear, and nosed into the storm. Dale Voss saw them go. Dale ran the feed store on Route 9, and he lived in the house behind it, and he was standing at his window with a cup of coffee, watching the snow pile against his loading dock, when the 4440's headlights cut through the white. He told people later at the co-op that he'd seen Earl Braddock drive into a blizzard on a tractor that was older than half the county. Said it with a laugh. Said Earl should have stayed home like everybody else with sense. Said that 4440 would be in a ditch by noon. 3 guys at the counter laughed with him. They were still laughing when they heard what happened next. Dale had a point, in a way. By every reasonable measure, what Earl was doing was foolish. The wind chill was -32. The visibility was 0. The roads were buried under 2 feet of snow with drifts up to 8. He was driving a 46-year-old tractor with a cab heater that barely worked and a windshield seal that let the cold in like a sieve. He had no GPS, no communication except the landline at each farm, and no backup. If the 4440 broke down 5 miles south of town, he and Nathan would be on foot in a blizzard that was killing cattle. Nobody was coming to get them. The plows weren't running. The ambulance couldn't move. If Earl's tractor died, Earl might die with it. He knew all of that. He'd done the math in his head, standing at the kitchen window. And then he'd done the other math. The math that Dale Voss and the men at the coffee counter never bothered to do. 12 farms, north of 2,000 head. If nobody got to them by nightfall, the losses wouldn't be 6 head or 10 head. They'd be in the hundreds. Calves first, then the old cows. Then the ones trapped against fence lines. 2,000 animals, depending on men who couldn't reach them, in a county that had 3 plows behind doors that wouldn't open. Earl didn't weigh the risk against his comfort. He weighed it against Harold Minke, sitting alone in a barn at 74 years old, with cattle dying around him, and nobody coming. That math was simple. That math had only one answer. If you're not a cattle farmer, let me explain what a blizzard means when you've got livestock. It means your animals are dying while you watch the Weather Channel. Cattle can survive cold. They're built for it, but they can't survive cold, plus wind, plus no water, plus no feed, plus drifting snow that buries their shelter and traps them against fence lines where they pile up and suffocate. A blizzard isn't a snow day for a cattle farmer. It's a countdown. The first farm Earl hit was Merle Gustafson's place, 3 miles south on County Road 600. The road didn't exist anymore. It was a white plain. Earl drove the 444 down the center line by memory, using fence posts as guides when he could see them, which was about 1 out of every 10. The snow was up to the axles. The 4440 pushed through it like a ship through heavy seas. Slow, deliberate, the engine never straining, never surging. Just that steady Walter Braddock idle that said I was built for worse than this. Merle was in his barn when Earl pulled in. He'd been trying to break ice on his stock tank with a hammer for 2 hours. His cattle were bunched against the east fence line where the snow had drifted 6 feet high. 8 head were partially buried. Merle was 71, and his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold the hammer straight. Earl and Nathan spent 40 minutes at Merle's place. Nathan broke the ice. Earl used the 4440's front loader to push the drift back from the fence line and free the buried cattle. Merle stood in the barn door and watched them work and didn't say anything. But when Earl climbed back on the 444, Merle grabbed his arm and held it for a second. That was enough. The second farm was the Dietrich place. Larry Dietrich had 90 head pinned against the south fence line, where the timber created a wind funnel. The drift was so deep that Earl had to push through it 3 times with the loader before he could even see the fence. Larry had been trying to dig out his cattle with a snow shovel since 3 in the morning. His face was gray. His eyebrows were frozen. He couldn't feel his feet. Earl told him to go inside. Larry said he wasn't going inside until his cattle were clear. Earl didn't argue. He just put the 4440 to work and let Larry stand there and watch, because sometimes a man needs to see his animals saved with his own eyes before he can let himself stop. Then the Holloways, then the Reinhardt place. A young couple who'd been running cattle for exactly 2 years and had never seen anything like this. They were standing in their kitchen, holding their 6-month-old baby, and crying when Earl's headlights came through the snow. The wife opened the door and just said, "The calves." Earl nodded. Nathan was already walking toward the barn. They saved 11 calves that had been separated from the herd in the drift. 3 of them had to be carried to the barn by hand. Nathan carried 2 of them himself, 1 under each arm, through snow up to his waist. And when he set them down in the barn straw, the young wife grabbed his arm and said, "Thank you," so many times it stopped sounding like words. If you're still watching this, subscribe. These stories only get told here. At every farm, the same thing. Frozen tanks, buried cattle, drifted shelters, farmers who'd been alone in the dark since midnight, trying to save animals they couldn't reach. Earl plowed access. Nathan broke ice and forked hay. They left each farm and pushed further south into the storm. The 444 never hesitated. The engine never coughed. Earl's hands went numb at farm number 4, and he didn't tell Nathan. He just wrapped them tighter around the steering wheel and kept driving. Harold Menke's place was the farthest south, 7 miles from town, on a dead-end road that ran along the timber. Earl had been driving for 5 hours by the time he reached the turn. The snow was deeper here, The timber created a wind tunnel that piled drifts 8 feet high across the road. The 4440 hit the first drift and slowed to a crawl. Earl dropped into first gear. The engine lugged. The rear tires bit. The tractor shoved through 300 yards of packed snow that would have stopped anything else in the county. They found Harold in his barn. He was sitting on an overturned bucket beside a cow that was down. The cow had been trapped against the fence, and Harold had spent 3 hours digging her out by hand. 74 years old, alone, in a blizzard, with a grain scoop in his bare hands because he'd lost his gloves somewhere in the drift. His fingers were white, not cold white, frostbite white. Earl took one look and told Nathan to get the first aid kit from the cooler. Nathan wrapped Harold's hands while Earl worked the cattle. 180 head spread across 640 acres in a whiteout. Earl couldn't save them all from the cab of a tractor, but he could open lanes. He could push back the drifts that were suffocating them against the fence lines. He could break the ice on the main tank. He could pile hay where the cattle could reach it. And that's what he did for 2 hours in minus 32 wind chill on a tractor with a leaking windshield seal and a cab heater that put out about as much warmth as a birthday candle. Harold lost 6 head. 6 out of 180. In a storm that should have killed 40, he lost 6. And the only reason he lost 6 instead of 40 was that a man he'd known for 30 years drove 7 miles through a blizzard on a 46-year-old tractor that had no business being out in that storm, but went anyway because its engine was built by a mechanic who believed that a machine should start when you need it to start, no matter what. By farm number 8, Nathan had stopped talking, not from anger, from cold. His lips were blue. Earl could see it in the loader light when Nathan climbed back on the fender after breaking ice at the Muller place. Earl told him to get in the cab. Nathan shook his head. There wasn't room for 2 in that cab, not really. And Nathan knew that if he got warm, the cold would hit twice as hard when he went back out. So he stayed on the fender. He wrapped his arms around the cab bracket and buried his face in his hood and let the tractor carry him south, farm by farm, into the teeth of the worst storm either of them had ever seen. At the Schroeder farm, number 10, they found a heifer that had gone through a fence and was standing in the creek bottom, chest deep in snow and ice water. Earl couldn't reach her with the tractor. Nathan went in on foot, waded into that creek in minus 32 wind chill, got a rope around her neck, and led her back up the bank while Earl pulled from above with the loader. The heifer was shaking so hard her legs were buckling. Nathan's coveralls froze solid from the waist down within 5 minutes of getting out of the water. He didn't say a word. He climbed back on the fender, and they drove to the next farm. Earl hit 12 farms that night. 12 cattle operations. Somewhere north of 2,000 head of livestock. He drove the 444 for 14 hours straight, in conditions that the National Weather Service later classified as life-threatening. Nathan never left the fender. Ruth called the landline at every farm they stopped at, tracking their progress south and then back north, like a dispatcher, running a one-tractor rescue operation from a kitchen table in Gibson City. Virgil met them at the road when they came back. It was past midnight. The storm was breaking. Stars were showing through the clouds for the first time in 20 hours. Virgil walked up to the 4440 and put his hand on the hood, not to check the temperature. just to touch it. Like you'd put your hand on a horse that just carried you through something it shouldn't have survived. "How'd she run?" Virgil asked. "Like Walter built her," Earl said. Virgil nodded. That was the highest compliment either of them had, and it was exactly right. If you made it this far, hit that subscribe button and the bell. I'll see you on the next one. The county plows didn't reach the south end until the following afternoon, 22 hours after the storm started. By then, Earl had already been there and back. 12 farms, 14 hours, 1 tractor. The next morning, the sun came out like nothing had happened. That's the cruelest thing about a blizzard in Illinois. The day after is always beautiful. Blue sky, bright snow, everything sparkling and clean and quiet, like the storm was a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was 23 inches of snow on top of 12 farms worth of buried fence lines and frozen tanks and dead calves, and an old man in a hospital bed learning to hold a coffee cup with 8 fingers. Earl slept for 3 hours and then went out to check his own cattle. All 40 head were alive. The loafing shed had held. Nathan had broken the ice on the tank before they'd left the night before, and Ruth had gone out at noon with hot water from the kitchen to keep it open. The round bale was untouched. The cattle had been too stressed to eat, but they were alive. Earl stood at the fence and counted them twice. Not because he'd miscounted the first time, but because counting them felt like something solid he could hold on to after 14 hours of driving through a void. Dale Voss never told the story right. He told people Earl got lucky, told people any tractor could have done it, told people the storm wasn't as bad as people said. He told that version at his feed store counter for weeks, and the men who laughed with him had all been inside their houses that night with their furnaces running on backup generators, and not one of them had called a single cattle farmer to ask if they needed help. But here's the thing Dale never mentioned, not once, in all his retelling. Dale had a truck. Dale had a plow attachment in his warehouse. Dale had a CB radio and a generator and a warm store full of supplies. Dale could have done something. Dale could have called someone. Dale could have driven south himself. He didn't. He watched Earl go, and then he went back to bed. And 3 weeks later, he stood at his counter and told people Earl was crazy. And the men who laughed with him were the same kind of men, the kind who watch from windows and explain afterwards why the man who went out was foolish for going. Harold Menke lost 2 fingers to frostbite, the ring finger and pinky on his left hand. He spent 4 days at Carlo Hospital in Urbana. When Earl visited him, Harold was sitting up in bed with his hands bandaged and a styrofoam cup of bad coffee on the tray table. Earl sat down, and Harold looked at him and said, "That 4440 of yours," and then he stopped, and Earl waited, and Harold said, "Your daddy would have done the same thing." And that was the only time Earl cried about any of it, and he turned his face toward the window so Harold wouldn't see. But Harold saw, and neither of them mentioned it. The 4440 is back in the machine shed. Earl washed it the day after the storm. Pressure washed the salt and ice and manure off the fenders, checked the fluids, greased the zerks, and parked it in the same spot it always sits. If you walk into that shed today, you'd never know it went anywhere. It just sits there, green and quiet, beside the S680 and the 8R410, looking like every other piece of iron in the building. But it's not. And Earl knows it. And Virgil knows it. And 12 cattle farmers along the South Timber know it. And Harold Menke knows it every morning when he buttons his shirt with 8 fingers instead of 10, and doesn't complain because he's alive, and his cattle are alive. And somewhere in Gibson City, there's a 1978 John Deere 444. Oh, that started on the second crank in the worst storm in 30 years and carried 2 men into the dark, because that's what it was built to do.